Okay, so back when Generation 1 was created, and we're talking about the prototype, there were supposed to be 237 moves total, at least that we know of. However, only 165, so that's 237 total moves, but there was only 165 of them that ended up making it in the final release of the game. In this video, we're going to try to cover like what some of those moves were and what happened to them and what I generally think happened to them over time. But it's also worth noting that, and we'll come back to this point a little later on, but keep this in mind though. In Gen 2, there were 86 moves that were then added to Gen 2. So Gen 1 had 165, then you add 86, and then it ends up being 251 total moves. So is that a coincidence that there's 251 Pokemon? And yeah, you could basically see what they were probably going for. But keep in mind though, the idea that they had when they made Pokemon, a lot of these ideas were supposed to be in Gen 1. If you actually watch this channel, we've actually documented that there were Pokemon moves in animations that were actually legit and supposed to be in prototype, was supposed to be in Gen 1, but they didn't make it until Gen 2. And a lot of these moves were either recycled into something else or eventually found themselves in Gen 2, as we'll cover. But what I think is really interesting is I'm going to have to go back and really look at what those moves were. But the only way I can pull it up realistically is by seeing if the Pokemon themselves have learned anything. So like I have learned that a lot of these moves were probably reused into something else when Pokemon was later made, but they just probably came back to it later on. You know, just like anything else in Pokemon, they had the idea, but they just didn't program it because either cartridge limitations, time deadlines, or maybe they just felt like, well, we could always come back to this. You know, they knew that when they were making Pokemon Gen 1, they knew that, hey, you know what, maybe we should make another one. And then they started making more of them. And I mean, now they have a bunch of ideas. So it kind of goes back to debunking the ideas. I mean, is Game Freak running out of ideas? I don't think they are. I think it's just mostly time deadlines and what are they, like they're trying to make it look realistic, sort of. That's what a lot of people get wrong with what they do with their games. I think a lot of them, you know, they realize that when it comes to programming stuff, they want it done a certain way, and sometimes it can be hard. You know, I definitely can understand like maybe the pain Satoshi Tajiri was going through when he had all these ideas, but you know, he was forced to scrap a lot of them, and he probably knew the series wouldn't be what it was until they really started making more Pokemon games and they started throwing those ideas into that later on. And even to this day, there's still tons of ideas they haven't used for whatever reason. But again, we'll get to that later on though, as we will cover, because hopefully maybe somebody can go back and make a ROM hack or something where they can use this stuff or utilize, because you know, people are always creating new things. So anyways, so yeah, so 251 moves in the final version of Pokemon Gen 2. And in Gen 1's final version, there was 165. Now in the prototype of Gen 1, there was 237 moves. So that's 72 moves. Let's just focus on Gen 1 for right now, that were never seen. Now, according to this prototype, well, data that they've been able to leak off Game Freak servers, we know for a fact that some of these moves were actually the same ones you find in Gen 2. Like, if you don't believe me, and even the Pokemon cards too, you might actually be surprised that if you remember, very closely remember, the Pokemon, like not the first editions, not, you know, not that, but like the very first sets that were released, like the fossils, the I just don't remember off the top of my head, the different base sets that were released throughout Pokemon, the original 151. You might remember how some of those cards had attacks on there that weren't in the final version of the game, but eventually they were though. Like Kadabra, for example, had an attack called Super Psy. It was a psychic attack. It was somewhere in between psychic and I think Psy Wave. because some Pokemon moves, because keep in mind, you know, and this is how we could tell, because depending on how the move, like how many power points it had, you know, like the PPs, how many times you could use the move, the attack had its own base power and everything. Was it a special? Was it a physical? It depended on, well, I mean, now as the series went on, they later on made different type attacks that were focused on just that alone. But in Gen 1, the way, and I think Gen 2 had the same problem, was depending on the attacks and everything that they were using, they used different types of, you know, depending on, it would be like a single stat. So like water attacks were all special, fire attacks were all special, grass types were special. I could be wrong though. But and then you had like physical ones were like poison and normal attacks. Let's see what else. You see what the idea was, you know. So depending on the type, it would be either special or attack. It wasn't both, but you have to look up which ones they were because I don't know them all off the top of my head. But it just kind of really made, you know, it was kind of interesting to think though that as time went on, like there were certain attacks that weren't really there like as much. So like one thing that always threw me off is like there's not a balance between some of them, you know, kind of like, you know, if you look at the typing advantages with Pokemon, like in Gen 1 there was only 3 ghost types. You had Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar, the family there. But some people have speculated, well, wasn't there supposed to be more ghost types? And then eventually when Gen 2 came out, we saw there was a lot of ghost types. Exactly, right? And then you also had the concept that, you know, they had a lot of ideas, but maybe they only had so many, you know, so they were forced to not only go with cartridge limitations, but they also had the concept that, you know, well, they'll just take half and half for now. And they still had an abundance of Pokemon. I mean, it still took a while to catch 151 Pokemon in the original, even though there's people that speed run it. But it's still interesting how they do that. But even if Pokemon originally had 191, let's just say, I mean, it's interesting to think like a lot of the moves that they had as well, like, you know, because Dragon type moves would come next. You would be surprised that there's not a lot of Dragon type moves in Gen 1. There's only one Dragon type move, and that move was supposed to be Dragon Rage. But it always did a fixed number of damage, 40 damage. It didn't do any more, didn't do any less. It was a really good attack for something that was doing fixed damage as long as it hit. So, but then basically, according to our research, another one that we managed to get was supposed to be Mega Fire. Was supposed to be, if you're a Final Fantasy fan, and that's where Satoshi Tajiri got it from, because there's no other explanation I can think of. It's Bahamut's, you know, Lord of the Dragons, special attacks, Mega Flare, you know. If you play like if you play Final Fantasy IV, I believe, you fight Bahamut as well as Leviathan and all that. And of course, you know, he's in Final Fantasy V, Final Fantasy VI, going based on the Japanese release, not the first ones that were ever released outside of Japan, because that's a little confusing to some people. But if you're a Final Fantasy fan, you know exactly what I'm getting at. I don't know if he was in Final Fantasy III, I just can't remember off the top of my head. But basically, the Lord of the Summons, basically. I know he was in Final Fantasy 1, but you don't fight him, though. You know, he's just there as like he promotes your characters, you know. So that's actually pretty cool. So, yeah, Final Fantasy 2. It could have been in Final Fantasy 2, but I don't think so. Maybe. But under a different name, though, before he passes away. Anyways, so in Final Fantasy, you basically come across that kind of you come across that. So they only had 2 Dragon moves in Gen 2. And I think Mega Fire was eventually recycled into Dragon's Breath in Gen 2. As we will tell, let me tell you something. As well as a lot of other moves that didn't make it in Gen 1 would have been recycled into something else. It's also possible that some of these moves that we found in Gen 1's prototype could have been recycled into something else in Gen 1, but with the same effects, but maybe different animation. Let me give you an example. There is an attack called Ink Spray that actually, surprisingly, was supposed to be, somehow it was like a TM or an HM. If you pull up the HM menus where you teach your Pokemon like Surf and Flash, and eventually, like, it's kind of confusing, like, why the game registers it like that. Maybe there's a reason. Maybe it was an unused HM at one point. Who knows? But I don't know. I don't know how the game saved it and how they, like, what its intention was, but I do think that, and based on what Helix Chamber was saying in some cases when they released some of the prototype data they found, and by the way, it is true, by the way, so it's not fake. They did state that a lot of the stuff that they did find was actually recycled into something else, because it kind of made sense. Like, so like ink spray would later be recycled into, like, let's say smoke screen, for example, or so yeah, smoke screen would be an attack, you know, Horsey and what was it, Horsey and Seadra, and I believe Kingdra, and then later on, I mean, it kind of made sense that fire type Pokemon could learn smoke screen because they're fire types, but I don't necessarily know how like a water type Pokemon can smoke screen something, unless they're talking about like a different type of smoke screen, maybe like ink spray or something like that. But I think maybe that's why they, you know, like, it might not make sense, but like in a way at the same time it kind of does. I think if we just kind of think of it like they're using like a different type of smoke screen, using ink in this case. Kind of like Splatoon, but in the early days of Pokemon. But anyways, but yeah, so it kind of made sense though, because a lot of these moves were recycled into something else. Dragon's Breath would have been Mega Fire, even though it was a Dragon type move, and it was like a different type of Dragon's Breath. You know, what was it? Was it fire? Was it something that causes paralysis? You know, like an electric move, but it was a Dragon type move instead. So that's pretty cool, actually, a way to think about it. Then you had some Pokemon moves in Gen 1's prototype that kind of was, like, at the same time, like, more self-explanatory. It just wasn't in the final version, but it was like a weaker version. You had, like, Powdered Snow. You don't get Powdered Snow in Gen 1. That was actually supposed to be in Gen 2. And so, basically, from what we understand, Articuno didn't originally have Ice Beam. Not yet, at least. It actually had Drill Peck and Powdered Snow. So it had Powdered Snow, learned Ice Beam later on, and Drill Peck. And then Moltres had Drill Peck as well, didn't have Peck. And it had, I think it was Ember. It still had its original Ember move. But later on, it would start learning like all the other attacks that it would have in Gen 2. Like, a lot of it was recycled into something else. And there's still some scrapped ideas that they had, but maybe they just recycled it into something else. I also do think that they did decide to replace a lot of the moves as Pokemon has gotten, you know, expensive. Not expensive, expandable, sorry. They've decided to keep adding on to stuff, obviously. So a lot of the Pokemon moves that we do have been recycled into something else, but also they've been recycled into they've also extended the lists, and maybe a lot of ideas that they originally had were also extended as well. So we all had, like, so eventually, you know, they might have had those weaker fire type moves that they never use, or those dragon type moves that they never use. Like I'll give you an example. So like from Gen 1 to Gen 2 to Gen 3, we started having more dragon type moves. Dragon Claw introduced to Gen 3. We also had in Gen 2, Outrage was finally introduced, so now they actually gave dragon type moves like a more signature move, because a lot of these moves were supposed to be based on their types, and a lot of different Pokemon were being forced to be taught different types based on like the CDs that they saved them as, like, like TMs and whatnot. But it's also very interesting that a lot of the Pokemon moves were also learned because, like, depending on what the kind of Pokemon they were. So if they were like a dragon type, how many dragon type Pokemon can you think of that learn the move Outrage? Just about a lot of dragon can learn Outrage. And it is a very powerful physical attack. You know, dragons have finally been, you know, especially since they dropped the dragon types or just special type moves and they decided to make them physical. So are there some dragon type moves that are special attack? I try to think off the top of my head. I think so. The Dragon Pulse, I do believe is, or was it Dragon Pulse? You know, the more I think about it, maybe Dragon Pulse was actually also supposed to be Mega Breath too. No, because it makes sense. Dragon Pulse is still like kind of like Dragon's Breath, but more powerful. But yeah, it just goes to show you that a lot of the moves that they might have came up with were also based on earlier design choices as well. It makes sense. So at some point they did decide to create a bunch of Pokemon moves that were based on something else at one point. That's actually very interesting. So, what do we got? Let's see here. So, but Dragon Pulse wasn't introduced until like what, Gen 5? Was it in Gen 4? You also had Dragon Rush. That was in Gen 4 though, wasn't it? Yeah, Gen 4 had Dragon Rush. Gen 5 had Dragon Pulse. Because I know Kurium could learn it, but I'm not sure. I know was it Hydration? I always forget how you even pronounce that. So I always forget how to spell it. But that Pokemon where you had to evolve it all the way up to like level 68 or something like that. And that Pokemon was a tank, man. But so again, ice type Pokemon save the day, man. You get an ice type Pokemon, them dragons are dead. But that's why Lapras will always be one of my favorites. Anyways, so what else is there? So yeah, going back to Gen 1. So a lot of these moves we're still kind of thinking about, but there will be a list that will be provided. But this is just to kind of explain right now that yes, there is in fact a lot more than we see, and there is definitely a lot more than we can really put our hands around right now. I do think as time goes on that we will eventually figure this out, but right now, I mean, at least for me anyways, because I'm doing this all myself, the information might be out there, but nobody's talking about it. So I don't know how many other people might have found it or have mentioned it. So this is very interesting, actually. So I want to keep looking for it because I find it very fascinating. So right now, this is what I found. Okay, so keep in mind, a lot of the moves that were introduced later on in the series might have been ideas from previous games. And there's three things they could have done. Either one, they were delayed and then they were just eventually put into the games later on. Their designs might have been a little different. Their powers, their power points might have been a little bit different. Their stats might have been different. But they still ended up using them at some point. Then you got the other ones where they might have been changed into something else. We'd have to kind of compare and contract depending on how they work. Or three, maybe they never used them yet up until this point. So maybe a lot of ideas that they did decide to fill in. I mean, we can look at it like, I mean, we could do the next best thing and think, well, okay, maybe there's some Pokemon moves that they didn't use right away that they did recycle until later on. I'll give you an example. One Pokemon move that they didn't use in Gen 1 or Gen 2 that I've seen was Sky Uppercut. Blaziken learns it, for example. It's a fighting type move, obviously. But from what I understand, that attack was not introduced until Gen 3. However, though, there's reason to believe it could have been in Gen 1 at some point. So how it didn't make it in Gen 1 and Gen 2, maybe they took a bunch of other fighting type moves and they introduced them some other way, you know what I mean? So like, you know, you had high jump kick. Yeah, high jump kick. I don't know if there's any more after that, like rolling kick. There's so many other ones, but you basically get the idea. But like, I think they just decided the way Nintendo was looking, or Game Freak was looking at it at first, was how do the Pokemon like realistically look at this? Like, how would they learn these attacks? And it was all based on different types of elements too, depending on the elements they were, depending on their characteristics of the creature that we know of. So it kind of made sense in a way. So again, you have Pokemon like fighting type moves, and then they'd go based on their fighting type move pool. What could they learn? What did they not? You know, it just made sense, you know? So that's how I'm looking at it. I think a lot of moves also were not finished as far as their animations go. They could have been recycled into something else, and maybe that's why they were scrapped. But that's going to be the hard part, is trying to figure out what they were recycled into, because while we might have reasons to believe what they might have been, it could have been exactly this, or it could have been just a weaker version of that. So we have to just kind of compare and contrast and really go off of that. But at the same time, we should just be happy that as the series went on, they added more stuff. So an idea emerges, they created it, and now we have more move pool ideas. So we have more dragon type moves, we have more ghost type moves. You know, we have all types of different Pokemon move pools. I think right after I make this video, I'm gonna go on the internet. I'm gonna look up like how many total moves they had for like each type, and it'll just be interesting to see like how far the series has come like all together. Because I have played up until Gen 8. I have beaten Gen 8, but as of right now, I mean, I really have not noticed off the top of my head how many different moves that we like have. Like, there's just so much stuff that there's just so much stuff in this series that even people that make ROM hacks, like it's just mind-blowing to think that you could literally put hundreds of hours into a single run of a game now and still not be done with it. You know what I mean? It's nuts. Just some of the stuff people come up with, like, it's because it works, you know. That's how Pokemon was. And I think a lot of people underestimate that with Pokemon. You know, it was always like, it always worked like that. So yeah, 237 moves that were at least introduced. 72 of them were later on scrapped. When Gen 2 hit, how many more of those moves made it into that game, and how many more did they add that weren't in Gen 1? That could have been introduced for Gen 2, or maybe just Gen 2, you know what I mean? And then later on, they did the same thing. So like, every time you make a sequel to a game, there's two things that happen. You got the ideas they used for that game, and then the ideas that they carried over from the previous games, you know, because the series kept progressing. So what did we see that made it into Gen 2? And what ideas didn't they use, you know? That's another way to look at it. So yeah, we'll figure it out as time goes on. But it's always compare and contrast to the final versions and what we might have. But I found this out last night. I thought it'd be interesting to share. I'll make another video once I find it. But until then, I'm going to have to go digging through the Pokemon prototype again and see what of these 72 moves that I can find. I think I found a good 16 of them. But we're going to see if we can find more of them. And the only way I can think of that we can do it is by pulling up a list of like the move pools of every single one of those 191 Pokemon. So yeah, this is going to be interesting. So again, if you're a big fan of this kind of stuff, please subscribe. If not, I'll try to dig around for the animations and show it off and see what it does. But basically, that's all I can do right now is, you know, kind of show it off. Because if we can figure out what those moves were, or at least get an idea of what they were named to, we can kind of compare it to like Gen 2 and say, oh, hey, you know, a lot of those moves kind of look familiar, you know. It'll be interesting to see what we stumble across.